Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Catherine McEwan question and answer session. Tonight we're doing IBD in the workplace, and this has been a topic which has been talked about for lots of different people dialing into previous question and answer sessions. It's come up in different formats. It's been a very big week for the country. On Monday, lots of freedoms came away. Yesterday, all the young people at school got their results. So employment is at the front of a lot of people's brain this week, whether they're in employment and coming back to a more traditional workplace than they've been in for quite a long time, or for people coming out of education, what employment they're going to get and what opportunities there are. So I'm delighted we have three very helpful people on the session tonight to try and answer all of your questions related to IBD and employment. So I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves. If I can start with Kerry.
Hi, thanks Richard. So my name is Kerry Hislop. I'm a HR director at HR Services Scotland. Just from my background, I have been in HR for 21 years and predominantly a HR manager in the NHS for most of that. So at the moment, it's, for me, it's about how the employer and employee relationship works day to day. How employers understand what the condition is, what questions to ask, how to be open and honest, having difficult conversations, and occupational health and reasonable adjustments in terms of how the workplace can help and support people.
Magic. Thank you, Kerry. Good evening. And Graham.
Hi, thanks, Richard. Yeah, my name's Graham Mitchell. I'm a partner at Clyde & Co. I started as a lawyer 25 years ago, and I've done employment law for most of that. I advise clients on disability regularly and appear in tribunal. I act for employers and employees, so I see both sides of the dynamic. And similar to Kerry, we work in the same sort of space to an extent, in that quite often it's when it comes to a crunch and when there's difficult decisions to be made, difficult conversations to be had, and that's where we work out and advise clients. And obviously the important thing to note is that there is a lot of protection under the legislation. It's the Equality Act that provides protection for people who are actually disabled, and that's really the kind of core of what maybe we'll touch on later today.
Brilliant. So we have HR, we have an employment lawyer, and I'm delighted to introduce Caroline, who is a patient. So Caroline, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and just really help set the context for this evening. So thank you very much for joining us.
Okay. Hi everyone, and thanks Richard. I am a patient. I do have Crohn's disease, and I was asked to come on board this evening just to kind of talk through an experience that happened to me recently within the workplace whenever my health situation changed, and the action that happened, and maybe some of the lessons I learned from that as well. So just to give you some background and context, previously I actually worked in HR management for around about 6 years. I changed career after the birth of my daughter, worked for about 10 years in child development and also training and development consultancy as well. I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease back in 2009. I had periods, as many patients do, of relapse and remission, but I did have quite long periods of remission, which was very lucky for me. However, in 2014, I became very seriously unwell, to the extent that I actually had to leave work, and that was my decision. My symptoms really seriously hampered my ability to work at that time, and I had to really rethink my career and my work-life balance. It took a long time to recover. In 2015, then I started some voluntary work to get back into the workplace, and I then, in 2017, I took up a part-time position in retail, just to again cement that whole work-life balance. It was just trying to get back into the workplace. Retail people is often notoriously quite a ruthless work environment. There's lots of staff turnover, but because I have quite a strong work ethic, I think a lot of patients with our conditions tend to be quite resilient because of what they have to deal with, and that comes through quite often. And because of my experience, but also the supportive management that I had at that point, it meant I actually really did initially, for quite some time, I actually felt really valued, and I progressed in the retail environment. I was one of the team's top performers, and I was given more responsibility. Because my skills were valued and I was supported by my managers, I probably, with hindsight, mistakenly didn't feel a need to make my health needs formal. I always went over and above what was expected of me with my work and my commitment. I was actually virtually never off sick in the 3.5 years from starting, and actually probably had the least sick leave of any of the team, ironically, despite having the conditions I have. Though I did get into some difficulties last autumn. So my health changed and deteriorated, and I became really unwell, initially for a period of about 7 weeks. At that same time, there was obviously the squeeze in retail throughout all of these lockdowns and so on. And we were really extremely busy and also understaffed. So it was a kind of perfect storm, if you like. Despite all this, I didn't actually, in that 7 weeks, I didn't take a single shift off. And I became more and more unwell. So much so that the hospital called me in, my inflammatory markers went through the roof, and the hospital called me in for an urgent colonoscopy to see what was going on. In the week prior to the procedure, a new management team started within the business, with a very different outlook to that of the previous management team. So, for example, one manager was heard to make comments about having to manage snowflakes with anxiety, or made comments about, their management style being centered around if people don't like things, they can just leave, and so on. So I felt particularly vulnerable. And I realized they didn't actually know me. They didn't know my work ethic, my past performance, any of that. And I hadn't actually made anything formal or made clear what my health situation really was about and what to expect. I got called for the urgent colonoscopy in the same week that the business was required to go into another lockdown, and it was really chaotic. I was asked, could I work a 13-hour shift to make up for my required self-isolation for the procedure and the procedure itself. And I was given a massive project, which was really impossible to complete, even if I wasn't so unwell. Sadly, my colonoscopy discovered that the Crohn's had really progressed and deteriorated. So I was having to trial medication that I previously had a really bad reaction to. So it was a really tricky time. I had informally made one of my managers aware prior to my return to work about my situation. But when I returned to work, I wasn't even asked how I was. There was no opportunity to discuss what support was needed, none of that. I was just given more and more pressure in an understaffed environment, without time or resources to complete tasks. Ultimately, I became very ill again, starting to bleed. That's kind of unusual in my Crohn's journey. So obviously everything was getting very aggravated. And I was really exhausted and kind of pushed to the brink at that point. It unfortunately resulted in me having quite a meltdown with one of the assistant managers. So it reached a real crunch point. And then when I asked to speak to the manager above after a really heavy shift, it was clear there was a real lack of awareness of the seriousness of the disease, and also a lack of awareness of just how poorly supported I'd been so far. By Christmas, I had an acute reaction to the medication. In New Year, I got really unwell, and there were a few near A&E episodes, and I had to start biologic therapy, which many of the people tuning in will be familiar with. And at that point, I had to go onto the shielding register because of the risks with that at that point. So it resulted in, I had a real dilemma, and I decided I was really struggling with how do I handle this? Even despite my experience in HR, I really found myself in a tricky situation. So I thought, well, I could do one of three things. I could leave, but I didn't want to do that. And also, why should I? I could raise a formal grievance, and I knew that was possible, but I really wanted to avoid going down that route if I could. I could try to bitterly carry on, but I don't think that was going to work. So I decided really to try another option, which was to try and push for education from within and for constructive change. So I sent in writing, and I think that was important. I sent in writing an overview of the illnesses, what stage I was at, what potential consequences there were from both the disease and the treatments, and what I felt would be reasonable support from the company that I would like to have. I had a risk assessment when I returned from shielding, where I really just actually took the bull by the horn and just made clear what my concerns were and how what had happened couldn't happen again. And actually, to give credit where it's due, my manager said they were actually really embarrassed that this had happened on their watch. And we agreed 4 weekly follow-up meetings to review things and put strategies in place. I also challenged the company HR team to commit to improvements company-wide and strategies to support others with invisible disabilities or chronic diseases. And I was actually asked to assist in driving that forward within the business. So more recently, I've been asked to apply for their diversity and inclusivity partnership within the company. And also the retail communication coordinator, they asked me to contribute back with an article which they featured front page and centre in the company magazine to really raise Crohn's awareness and my journey, and that goes out to about 1,500 employees. I would say things are still not perfect, but they're definitely heading in the right direction. And there were quite a few things that I learned from the experience with hindsight. I think first and foremost, I would say definitely your health has to come first. There's a vicious circle where if you prioritize your work over your health, which is what I did, then your health deteriorates further, and that actually ironically jeopardizes your work. So it is a real vicious circle. I also learned that no matter when you feel supported and feel you have good working relationships, things can change. So you might feel secure just now, but it's important to put things in place for change in that. So, you know, companies can change, management can change, and your health can change quite quickly. So I just kind of learned not to be caught on the back foot with that. I learned don't be a martyr. Just to speak up and to really advocate for positive change where you can, for yourself and others. It is important to know, and you can feel more confident if you know your obligations and rights, and also the employer's obligations and rights. I think that helps give you that knowledge, gives you that confidence. I thought it was really important to say that it's important not to leave things open to misunderstandings as well. I think having things in writing helped, and I regretted not doing that in the first place, so that everybody's kind of clear on the issues and also people's commitments as well, because sometimes that can get lost in translation. And lastly, I think often it's actually lack of education and awareness that can be the source of the problem. And I discovered you can actually positively change that. So that was really the lessons I learned from the experience. And I wish I didn't have to go through the experience to learn the lessons, but hopefully that might help others.
I think, you've been very brave throughout the whole thing, Caroline, and I think listening to your story and hearing all the challenges that you face and how courageously you took them on is inspiring, I'm sure, to everyone listening, me included. So thank you for sharing your story, and I think it really sets the context for IBD in the workplace perfectly. I think I don't know how much your HR experience played into things, and whether that gave you the confidence or the resilience at the most difficult points to hang in there. I think other people might have just thrown the towel in at several stages of your journey. So well done on all of that. Graham and Kerry, I'm sure there are probably a few things that have come up to you while you've listened to Caroline's story. I wonder maybe if I can start just by asking, Caroline obviously didn't, was employed. She didn't declare, her Crohn's disease or other problems to her employer initially. So for people listening tonight, are they obliged during either at the start of employment or when they develop an illness during the stage of their employment to tell their employer immediately? What are the rights and wrongs of that situation? Because people are often worried that they won't get a job, or that their job will change because they're letting their employer know that. So I wonder, maybe, Kerry, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult set of circumstances because of the legislation. So Graham will keep me right on this, having more sort of employment law direct knowledge, but no, there is no obligation, as far as I understand it, to disclose that. Many years ago there may have been, but legislation changes, and it's the Equality Act that has changed that. So there is no obligation to disclose. For me, it becomes more of an issue when it starts to affect work, if it starts to affect work, because, it's like anything else. It's like, mental health, any type of physical health. It's about the job that you do, and, are you starting to get affected by that? So is it making your symptoms worse? Are you someone that, flew before and was absolutely great doing everything, and then this has started to affect you? And that's the point really where I certainly would encourage, like, our clients to then start to have conversations with employees on that. It's about saying, we've recognized that something's different, or I don't know, your focus isn't there, whatever the case may be, and then that starts that conversation going, because just ignoring that from both employee and employer's point of view, it just doesn't help. It's about having that openness to say, we have noticed this. Is there something you want to talk about? Do we want to, have a conversation about what might have changed? And that's the time there when declaration is usually the best practice. Graham, I don't know if you've got anything else.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all of that. And I think it's about, there's no obligation on an employee to say what their health is. And especially when there's a a recruitment exercise at the start when you're trying to get a job. It's sort of slightly crazy of an employer to ask lots of questions like that. Not only in relation to disability, in relation to sexual orientation, in relation to race, because ultimately that could end up meaning that they are seen to discriminate if they don't appoint someone. But the other side of that is you may want to mention it to be supported. So there's no obligation to mention it. I think exactly to echo what Caroline and Kerry have said, there comes a point though where, if you're wanting to be supported and you want the support of the legislation and you want the support of the employer with the legislation, I suppose, behind that, you have to say what the condition is. And I think Caroline's exactly right, in a very polite but very clear email, with deadlines for when you maybe expect a response, or, just to keep things ticking along. And that doesn't have to be a grievance. That could be very constructive. It can be helpful. And quite often it's a return to work, return to work meetings. There's no format for them, but return to work meeting is usually when these things would be likely to come up. And one of the things that an employer can hide behind is they can say, well, we had no knowledge at all of the illness, and especially Caroline, who didn't have a day off work. So, the irony is that I suspect Caroline may well have been technically disabled in the definition of the Equality Act for some or all of that period of time, but yet not had a day off work. Now, if you ask somebody in the street, can somebody be disabled without a day off work? They would say, no, that doesn't sound right. But the reality of the law is really important, and maybe I should just mention this now. The whole of employment law really comes down to the definition of disability and whether it affects this condition. If we just take what Caroline talked about, if she allows me permission to do so.
Absolutely.
The way that the law works in this area for what the definition of disability is do you have a condition, and it can be mental or physical, that has symptoms that cause an adverse effect on your ability to carry out your normal day-to-day activities? Now, there's an awful lot in that. So if we take the end bit first, normal day-to-day activities can be right from brushing your teeth in the morning, taking kids to school, doing whatever you normally do, and even normal things like going for a walk, also your work activities and your evening activities. So what you look at is what was the before position, and then has this condition had an substantial adverse effect on your ability to do those things? Now, what's interesting is you discount the effect of medication when considering disability. Now, this is really important. So, for example, if you're taking medication or treatment at the moment such that you are able to function properly and do 99% of your activities, that's fine. But the question, you shouldn't be penalised for helping and taking the medication that your doctor says. So what you do is you look at, if you took no medication at all, what would the position be? And the position would be, I'll go back to what I was 4 weeks ago before I went to the doctor, that I was fatigued, I couldn't concentrate, couldn't get out of bed, I was going to the toilet regularly, whatever it is for you. And I know the symptoms are very, very wide for this group of illnesses. So that's where there's no answer that will say IBD equals disability. The question is, do the symptoms for you at that time, are they substantial enough for you to meet the definition of being disabled? And then you're discounting the effect of medical treatment. And the other thing that Caroline mentioned I thought was very interesting, you have large spells when you're in remission. And again, the law sort of looks at that and says, well, that would be unfair if somebody's only disabled when times are bad, and then they do everything the doctor tells them and they come in remission. Does that mean they're no longer a disabled person and that the employer can do whatever they want with them? Well, no. The question is, if the substantial effect has gone away, but it is likely to reoccur, and that's been defined as it could well happen, then it's deemed, it's like a kind of chain of perils, that the string passes to the next implement and you're actually strung together, you are disabled throughout. Now, being disabled in itself doesn't mean anything, but what it means is there's an obligation on the employer to do a lot of things like make reasonable adjustments, and also not to do negative things like pass you over for promotion and not to dismiss you or make you redundant, or even the recent ones have been put you on furlough when they didn't put other people on furlough. So there's an awful lot in that, but I agree exactly. It's about being clear, and sometimes you maybe want to say to one colleague or say to one manager, but if you don't put it in writing, sometimes that gets lost, you know.
Thank you very much. I think very, very helpful answers, and I think we'll pick up on some of these themes Joe has asked us a question. Joe, thanks very much for listening in, and thanks very much for your question. So Joe is a nursing student in Northern Ireland and has developed Crohn's disease during her studentship, and she isn't being given any allowance for her development of Crohn's disease and symptoms by her university or her employer. And she's asking, what can she do to tackle this?
Well, I can see there's two things there. So she's employed by someone if she's a trainee, but separately, she's getting access to education as well. So just the way the Equality Act works is it has a whole section about obligations on employers, but also has a whole section on people that provide services like education, like even train stations that provide transport, etc. So it's the same for both, really. That one, she would want to make clear the nature of her symptoms and I suppose the severity of it, and I suppose looking into the law a wee bit, if the severity is such, and maybe assert that she thinks she may well be disabled, and then number two, then you're putting the onus on both the education provider and the employer to say, well, there's an obligation for you to provide reasonable adjustments in order that I continue to get education, and similarly in order that I can do my traineeship. Now, I mean, we've done cases where we've had people doing accountancy exams that had to get more time, people with different things come in different formats in terms of the education side, and obviously for the employment side, part of the employer sometimes might say, well, I don't really know what you expect me to do, and that's what Caroline's point was. If you can be constructive and say, look, I think these 3 or 4 adjustments to the way we're currently doing things, I think they would maybe, some of them might be free, but I think they would assist me. And I think if she starts to go down that route, if she starts to hit barriers, then hopefully the force of the law is behind her. But that depends if the symptoms are severe enough to be disabled.
So I think nursing is obviously a physically demanding job a lot of the time. So a lot of the allowance is to work less, or to change the way that you're working. But if you're got an active flare of your disease, you're certainly going to feel more tired and drained and not going to be able to work to your same level. So in practice, the law is behind her. But Caroline, if you were faced with this situation, what would you actually do practically in this situation? So.
Yeah, I suppose it's back to those lessons that I learned in my experience, which is, what can I do to help myself here? And I was talking to Graham before about this whole sort of things seem to work best when you can find a middle ground. So when both parties can come constructively to try and meet with terms that are the best for both parties involved. So if you're making reasonable suggestions, then they can reasonably try and find ways to support those. Back to, again, as Graham reinforced there, trying to educate as well. I suppose there is, I find even within health services, there can be confusion about the diseases because they are more specialist than maybe some generalists might be aware of. So there might actually, ironically, even in health, be room for educating people just the implications of the disease in general, but also specific to you. Because as we've often touched on, the kind of experience as a patient can vary so hugely. So my symptoms could be quite different to someone else at a different stage of the disease, at a different stage in the remission relapse cycle and so on. So I think kind of educating and creating that awareness, that understanding, trying to build that trust goes a long way for both parties to get the best out of the situation.
Thank you. Kerry, I know that you don't currently, but you used to be HR within the NHS, and Jo might be working for the NHS, she might just be in the period before NHS employment. And Caroline was saying it seems ironic that if you're training as a nurse that you have to explain to your employers what something like Crohn's disease is, but taking her position, if you think back to your previous role within the NHS HR, how would this be approached, and what practical things are there to support Jo and others like her?
So yeah, I mean, I would certainly encourage Jo to speak directly to her line manager confidentially to start with. If it is the NHS, there will be a HR department there. So again, you can include them. The whole point of that service is that they know the law and they understand how that works, but also, it's that balance of supporting both parties. So I would say for the first point is to be open and approach your line manager first of all. Have things in writing, have notes, have things in writing down in front of you so that you can actually go through the issues, go through how it's affecting you. It might be the shift patterns, because I know that the shift patterns in the NHS, what they look like, it might be they have to shorten, they have to look at a different type of shift pattern for this particular circumstance. So go with some suggestions and some solutions, because I think Caroline's right there. It's about taking some of that ownership yourself, and understanding what you could probably offer, and then it's having that discussion and starting that ball rolling. Because if you don't, it will just roll and roll and roll and start to get bigger. And it's about taking that responsibility for yourself to say, I need a confidential meeting here, and I need to be open and honest about what my needs look like. And the NHS has occupational health, obviously internally, so there's no excuse really, if that's the situation, why that manager couldn't get advice directly from them as well, because they are, and I think a lot of private sector sort of clients that we look after don't really understand what they do. And for me, it's about, they are workplace doctors. They are, if it's a cardiologist for your heart, they are that for work. So that support's always there, and obviously an occupational health referral will then make the suggestions of what the adjustment should look like, so that helps the manager steer that. But as that conversation is, then there needs to be follow-up from that. It's about right, I think Caroline, you talked about it, weekly reviews, monthly reviews, whatever that looks like, going through the occupational health report, if that is the route. Looking at what adjustments can be done. If some can't, why can't they? I don't know, Graham will add, probably the bigger the employer, certainly tribunals will expect more to be done, more adjustments to be done, and more redeployment or cost than it might be a small business. So in a private sector company, it's different how it's managed to the public sector, but certainly that follow-up has to happen. And in good practice HR, every meeting that happens like that should be followed up in writing. And that employee must have that and see that and be able to have a trail of that to see that the manager supported them through it.
I guess it's easier as you're more experienced and you've had more work life, then you have the confidence to do this. But student nurses are often young, and they're potentially facing an embarrassing condition to talk about, combined with that. So I think it's although a lot of these things seem obvious in practice, I think trying to put them into practice, bearing those things in mind, can be more difficult.
I was just going to make the point. I didn't really have an opportunity to have access to occupational health, and it's something that Kerry mentioned. But speaking to other patients that have about their experiences, I think there often is a bit of a fear about occupational health, that they're an instrument to manage you out of a business or manage you out of a position and so on. But actually, the experiences that I've heard of from people have tended to be really constructive with occupational health, that they actually maybe take some of the tension out of that relationship because they're coming at it from an informed, objective position, and their suggestions, their framework is something that's maybe more readily accepted by the employer, or the, you know, in this context, maybe the university or whatever. So I think quite often that can be a really positive intervention, and maybe not something to be as feared as some people have.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on that. You know, it looks like it is an instrument, and it's, you know, we forever try and educate employers that that's not the case. You know, it's trying to help them and support them, you know, and often the better the referral that you give and the more information that you give, the better that the advice will come back. So it should be a, you know, triangulated approach. And again, it's being open with that employee that, you know, this is what occupational health do and why we want to refer you. I think also, to go back, Richard, on your point about this, you know, Joe being younger, you know, you can have people with you. There's nothing to say that she can't ask for a colleague, or, you know, it might even be a family friend if she's younger, to have with her for some moral support, and that's often absolutely fine to do that.
Good suggestion, buddy up. Just I don't want to spend too much time just on one thing, but Graham, Joe's come back to say that, you know, she's tried, you know, most of the suggestions that we've made so far. There's been no middle ground. She's not being offered a longer time to study, and she's been to occupational health, but they haven't adjusted, you know, anything significant about her working or studying life. So if you get into the kind of, these are the things that are meant to happen, you've tried them and you haven't got anywhere, where do you stand to go next, or how does the law support you to move forward from there?
Well, one of the things is, you know, it's something like even to go to ACAS or somebody to assist you at the next stage, because you then start to push against, you know, what you think, and also to make sure that whether they have done right or wrong, you know, you'd have to analyse the situation, the degree of the symptoms, and what's been asked and what hasn't been provided. But yeah, you would then want to push further. I know it does seem daunting, but I suppose the theme here is that there are obligations on employers here, and I think exactly right. I think the OH has got to be careful in that, and I actually know a few people who do the OH, and what they say to me is, look, quite often we get criticism that we're in the middle and our report is kind of vague and it says we'll review it again in 3 months. They're saying, well, the employee hardly gave me any information, the employer hardly gave me information, and they didn't give me access to the consultant's report. So I'm sitting there saying, well, we need to get this consult. So, you know, let's front end this in that if Joe can, or anyone can be very clear and with the information specifically on the symptoms, you know, the condition, the medication, prognosis, give consent to GP and consultant records, because sometimes that process can take weeks on end, and give clarity, but also in a positive way say, here's what I can do, and here's what I do think would be reasonable. And hopefully that works. If it doesn't, I'm afraid you're kind of getting into the lines of having to try and take legal routes to push that forward, whether with ACAS or a solicitor or a union or whatever else.
Okay, good luck from all of us, Joe. I hope things get better, and I hope that some of the advice has been useful to you. I want to come back, because this is a common theme that comes up a lot with patients, you know, relating to employment and sometimes to disability living allowance, is that you have to have a certain degree of disease activity or disability. And Graham, I think you touched on this before, you know, to qualify. So if you're for disability living allowance, for example, and unless you have lots of symptoms, then you don't necessarily qualify. And if you go into medication and stay well for a long time, then that you kind of lose that allowance. Can any of the three of you talk about how long that has to be for, or how long it applies for? So if you have a flare of your symptoms, you go on to a treatment, and you need to remain on that treatment with all the potential benefits, but also some of the side effects. Does your position change in terms of your disability under HR rules, or under legal rules, or under, you know, any other considerations?
Yeah, well, I'll take it first. I mean, I think I can answer half that question, but not the other half. So if your symptoms met the test of disability for that chronic spell, and if it was likely that may in the future at some time recur, then your status as a protected disabled person in terms of the Equality Act sort of continues on even in remission. As to disability and living allowance, I can't really answer that. I don't know what the rules are, but I suspect it might be that allowance turns off, but I'm not too sure about that.
And is it indefinite? Does it, how long can you be in remission for? Does it never run out, the definition, or?
Well, there's case law on this where somebody had chronic, it was mental health issues, and then there was a gap of maybe 5 years, and then they had a slight spell again, and another gap of 5 years. And the question is, it's not almost like a totting up of years. The question is, at the point when they stopped having them, and I think in that case it was when it came back in the 5 years, would the doctor say that this is likely to reoccur again? It's not a matter of whether it did or didn't. It's a matter of, and you'll know this, there'll be a range of, 100,000 in a sample. If they've had them, what's the chances that it would? And then the question, it's a factual question whether it was likely. Now, I'm afraid there isn't a yes or no answer to that because it depends on everyone's circumstance. I suppose you'll know with people, I put it this way, I suspect in relation to IBD, at the severe end, even if there's remission, even if treatment's going well, I suspect for many it's likely to reoccur at some point during their life. Would that be right?
It would be. So for the majority of patients, it's unlikely you could ever say that they're going to be, flare free indefinitely. So I think for most patients, unless they've had an operation, and even that then can come with consequences, then it would be likely that, you could never say, this won't recur again. So, I think most IBD patients, I would see, that as a continued lifetime risk, really, and I'm not really sure the circumstances. It would be very few patients that apply to that, it would go away.
Yeah.
And I think the key there is communication, isn't it? It's still, regardless of, how severe you might have been at one time, and then it's, thankfully got a bit easier. It's that regular communication. There should never be an employee and employer not speaking to each other regularly about work or any other matters. So, to me, the obligation there from the employer's point of view is to say, if they know about it and the employee has declared it and they've known they've had a serious, relapse or they've had serious illness, then, don't forget that. Just, every now and again, it's about saying, how are you? Are you feeling any better, any different? Are you on different medication? What's your consultant saying? Are you still under a specialist? Those conversations are fine to have. And I think, not only does that give a general interest in the fact that, you're human, it's about, monitoring that in a sense to make sure that, the employer does have the right things in place. And it might be that, I don't know, a change was made when, the employee got a bit better or didn't need to have that adjustment anymore, but actually it's not off the table. It could be brought back in again. And I think that's the key to all of this. It's about being open and honest and, going to your employer with, well, actually, I'm not feeling so great because of X, Y, and Z, and what can we do?
Yeah.
So I think, sorry, Caroline, I think what you've said therefore is there is no specific run out. It just is a regular review and see whether any adjustments need to continue or can be discontinued. But from an HR perspective, there isn't an automatic, you've had it for 6 months, things have been okay, therefore the support which was there is withdrawn, or?
No.
Okay, Caroline, sorry, please.
Yeah, no. I was just going to chip in a wee extra point, because obviously everything that everybody said is so great. But I think I would have been better setting up things and getting things put in place when I was more well, rather than waiting to a crisis point, and also waiting until the business was in a crisis point too, where it was much more difficult for things to be put in place, because even literally getting the opportunity to speak to anyone was really difficult. And I think one of the other points is that I think I'm right in saying that one of the criteria in terms of sort of legal parameters and so on is the idea of lifelong conditions. Sadly, as far as I'm aware, that we have access to treatments, and hopefully they will help people's conditions and maintain remission for as long as possible. But my understanding is that both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease classify as lifelong conditions because currently there isn't a cure. So my understanding would be from that the possibility of relapse is quite clearly something that has to be considered, and in the majority of cases, sadly, is quite probable, even more than possible. So that would be my take. But
I mean, that's correct, absolutely correct. So even with all the good treatments that we have now, we would consider them lifelong conditions, and at present incurable. So you're definitely right there. I think we've touched in other Q's and A's on the impact not just on physical health but also on mental health, and IBD, particularly when it's very active, has profound impacts on mental health. So how does that sit? Often people are comfortable talking about physical health because it's obvious, but in terms of an employee, if they have anxiety, all of the things that can be commonly associated with, active inflammatory bowel disease or having a chronic condition, how does that play into employment and equality law? Is it considered in the same way or differently, or?
Yeah, I think I can see that. It's kind of the same way, if we take the same definition again, does the mental health condition have an impact on the ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities? And is it a substantial impact? And again, that's the test. Now, again, you discount the effect of medical treatment. So the classic being somebody that has never had a day off work, but that might be because they've got a good medication regime in relation to antidepressant medication or to reduce anxiety, so they've been able to cope. But the question is, without that medication, what was it like? And if it was that it was a substantial effect on day-to-day activities, it may be they're disabled as a separate thing relating to the mental health issue. And then the question there, though, and it's a good point that Caroline made, is it may be that the mental health issue hopefully is finite. For example, if there's been a bereavement, a divorce, a house move, there may well be all sorts of stress that have come in, but the hope is that would then pass, whereas the underlying IBD may be long term. So you have these kind of different charts and you get into this when you get into a case that actually runs to tribunal, that the tribunal has to determine at what point do they have protection under the Equality Act and in which respect. And it might actually be for various different periods in time. And guess what? If at the time there's an actual OH report where everyone's been candid and whatever, it's really clear. But if you leave it for a year later, you're sort of trying to prove what your conditions were a year ago, and it's very difficult for a medical expert to have any comment on that of any substance. So yeah, there is protection there. I suppose one thing to say is, remember, one of the reasonable adjustments, I think we always think of reasonable adjustments as in physical things and maybe adjusting shifts and all the rest of it, but one of the reasonable adjustments can be that the employer accepts less output than another employee. So for example, if it's a kind of a widget factory and everyone's working 8 hours a day and producing 100 widgets, it may be that because of your disability, whether mental health or IBD or whatever, it may be a reasonable adjustment. We'll expect 65 widgets from you. And the problem occurs if the employee, if it gets to the point that they're no longer able to do the majority of their job. So if in effect they're only producing 10 widgets, there does come a point where the employer can move to go through a capability process that may lead to a fair dismissal, but that would be in really quite an extreme situation where really the employee is really no longer doing the job at all, and all the adjustments have been exhausted, and even with those adjustments, they can no longer do the job at all. And I think that's maybe where the OH gets a bad name, because in those scenarios, yes, the OH is looking at it, but if that is what the reality is, then there does come a point, and then different things. If you're in NHS, you might have good sick pay, you might have also other good stuff there, but there does come a point if you're at that end. But I think Caroline's a testament to a lot of people that I hear If anything, they give 120%, and then they go down to 80%, they go back to 120%. I think the employer over the year gets somebody that, if they've got trust and support from that employer, sure as hell they'll be the ones that in the good times will actually value it, because they'll know that not all employers are like that, so they'll want to stay longer. And there's an irony there, and I think Kerry's probably seen that we've probably dealt with a lot of clients where, you know, that we've got some cynical ones that just want to save money and do all the rest of it, but it's short-term planning, because if you build up relationships, other people will also, there's that silent majority in the work, will view how Caroline is treated and say, I like this employer, or they'll view how Caroline's treated and say, do you know what, I'm going to work at the place next door because this place is a share of whatever's. So that's why I think hat off to Caroline for, I suppose, taking the education part and taking it wider than just herself, which is a very brave thing with a condition that's quite like an embarrassing condition.
And your Caroline, your sort of experience is very much what we would call like presenteeism. You know, you kept going in, and you know that's when you talk about the mental health side of it as well. That is so classic in that sense, because you know, people just are on autopilot and they just go in and do the job, and actually it's not till it's a breaking point, like you've had a catalytic event, that then it all comes crashing down. So, you know, it's important to speak to the people that are at work, sometimes more than it is the people that are off sick. That makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I can compare it with a previous example when I did feel supported originally by the previous management team. And I actually, many patients will know Crohn's disease and any form of IBD can affect other parts other than the bowel. And so I developed uveitis and kept insisting on coming into work, having had an injection in my eye, looked like something from Doctor Who. And they actually said, do you know what, Caroline, it's great that you're, you know, like offering to come in, but just stay at home. I think partly because I was scaring customers, but also because it was just, you know, you need a bit of downtime, and you know, when you come back you'll be better capable. And I think that's a good example of when it works better. So yeah, and I do think that, you know, the points that you made about like you're more likely to get more production out of employees if you're meeting them in the middle. I think, yeah.
Thank you. So, you know, I have another question now from Heather. Heather, thank you very much. And I think it is very topical just now when, you know, we have the Fringe on and lots of events over the summer. And Heather's asked if you're in a, you know, a temporary job or a summer job, for a short period of time, you don't have occupational health and things there, when do you tell your employer that you have IBD? Great question.
That is a good question. Do you know, one of the things here to note is this, that remember, for employment rights, for a lot of employment rights, you don't get them until you've been 2 years in a job. So the right not to be unfairly dismissed, I'm afraid you don't get that until you get 2 years in a job. So that's why it is quite tenuous for your first 2 years of work. The good news is all the Equality Act rights, and including disability and the other ones as well, race, sexual orientation, whatever, you get those rights from day one, from the first day that you start at the work. In actual fact, you get it before, because if you're not appointed because of one of those reasons, then that could be a disability claim. So again, it depends on degree, and I don't want to overstate this anymore. Depending on the degree of the symptoms of IBD, you may be disabled, and that means that you may have a protection. So if there's problems occurring, you may want to mention that to your employer at any time. And even if it doesn't reach the bar of being a disability at that moment, I think Kerry will probably say general sickness absence. If you've got anything that's you're even worried about being sick in the future, you know, you start to feel your mental health going, you start to feel any sort of health going, you want to have a clear conversation with the employer anyway. So I don't think there's any barrier as to when you say it. If anything, I wish both employees and employers would both have more reasonable discussions and not end up having to go to lawyers to have the discussions for them. I don't know if, Kerry, that's your experience. Or...
It absolutely is. And, you know, where you've said there, it's, again, day one rights, but it's also knowing that because if you don't know that, then you're just going to assume, oh, well, they can just pop me at the door. So ACAS, if there's no HR, as Graham's already mentioned, are there to guide you there. And it's having that knowledge to then, and the confidence, I guess, to then go back to the employer to say, well, actually, this is what I found out. And they should then, whether it's adjustments can be temporary, adjustments can be permanent. It really depends on the situation. But even if it's something that's temporary, review it, have those regular conversations to review how it's going. It doesn't mean just because you've got a summer job or you're on a fixed term contract that shouldn't get treated the same way at all.
Caroline, any practical advice from a patient perspective? So I guess if you're in this situation, taking out of the other things that you've said.
I suppose I find that one particularly interesting, and I suppose if it was me, being honest, in a temporary position, if I was in a period of remission, I would maybe wait. I wouldn't wait until I'd reached the stage that I was very, very unwell. But given that there isn't the obligation to disclose everything upfront right from the start, if I felt I wanted to kind of wait and see and feel a bit more secure and build up that trust with the employer in a temporary position, because if I, for example, felt it's pretty much early days, and obviously they're human, they're monitoring your performance, they want to get employees that are going to be the most productive for them and the easiest for them, to be honest. I probably, if I was in a stage of remission, would maybe hang fire and wait until I maybe was a bit more established and then have the conversation, but again, not wait until it was crisis point to have the conversation. I suppose everybody's different, but I think probably in that position, that's maybe what I would do. Yeah,
great. Okay. It's been great conversations. We're going to run out of time soon, so I'm going to ask you a few snappy questions, just so we can get everybody's questions covered. So Arlene has asked us a question. Thanks very much, Arlene. When someone's receiving regular infusions, so in her case every 8 weeks, would it be classed as a sick day, or is that the employee's choice? How does it work? It sounds illegal or an HR question. So
I'd say it's a reasonable adjustment for the employer to allow them to have time off to have those infusions.
Okay.
Yeah, it's going to be sickness absence. There should be no suggestion that they've got to take either unpaid leave or a holiday. That is a medical procedure, and even then, even if the medical procedure, I don't know how invasive or whatever, but if that means that they're unwell for the day after, you can self-certify as being unwell when you're unwell for the first few days. So.
I guess we might get into sticky grounds if you have a choice between having an infusion and something you give at home. How does that work? But I'm just gonna put that out there, but not let you answer it.
I'll just give an example. So mine aren't at the hospital. Mine are it's injections at home that I do. And one of the reasonable adjustments that I suggested, and my employer agreed to, was that I do my injections on a Sunday evening, and they've fixed my day off being a Monday, just to give me that little scope and a little bit of a window should I feel a bit ropey the next day.
Common sense.
Yeah.
A lot of it boils down to that common sense, and that's exactly it. You have them on a Sunday. What do you need? Do you need to start a bit later the next day? Do you need that day off? Do you need a different shift that particular week because you're flawed for that week? There's the possibilities are endless as long as you talk about them.
Another quick question. It sometimes comes up about blue badges and eligibility for blue badges and where people are. I guess it comes back to a common theme tonight, which is the spectrum of your disability or illness. So I guess from an HR or maybe a legal point of view, how bad do things have to be with IBD to qualify for a blue badge? Or
I'm afraid I don't know that's a kind of social security rules question.
Okay.
I don't know the degree of that. And remember, the word disability is got a completely different meaning in those rules compared to the word disability in the Equality Act. So the answer is I don't know.
Okay. Caroline or Kerry, anything?
I don't know.
I don't know either.
The social security side of it.
Okay. So listen, I'm going to just round things up here because we've run out of time, and I think it's a reflection that we could probably go on for another hour. The great quality questions we've had and the great quality answers. Lots of people have given very supportive comments to you, Caroline, and lots of people have actually stated the fact that lots of patients with IBD in the workplace give that 120%, and they're the ones who aren't off sick, and you know they're actually going above and beyond. So although we've talked about, I guess, the slightly negative side of things, sometimes I hope people feel that from all of the discussions tonight they're well supported, and with good treatment you're often at your work more than your other colleagues, and should you run into a sticky situation, then support is always there. So for everybody who's watching, please share the page. I think there's been lots of useful questions and comments here that lots of people won't have had the chance to hear tonight, but can hear on sharing them. I'd like to just to say thank you to Caroline, Kerry and Graham for giving up their time tonight. And all of the questions and responses have been excellent. So thank you very much. And tune in again in a few weeks for the next question and answer. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
All right.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you.